and welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine today. My name is Tamara Rosavan, and in our studio I'm joined by Mr. Volodymyr Yermolenko. He's a Ukrainian political expert and a lecturer at one of Ukraine's top universities. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Hello, Tamara.
So let's talk about some of these parallels that Western media has been drawing based on the conflict in Syria with Ukraine and Russia's involvement in both of those conflicts. Do you believe that Europe, and specifically France, and its relations to the conflict and how it's been reacting to the airstrikes that Russia started in Syria, do you think that they have reacted in a positive way? Even the media, which was one of the first ones to report on the downing of a Russian airliner in Egypt, and they were the first ones to say that ISIS was responsible for this, and it's basically because of Russia's involvement in Syria.
I think we Ukrainians, we probably understand a little bit better sometimes the logic of Russian operations, because there was an operation, there was a war in Georgia in 2008, and here in Ukraine, practically everybody was saying, look, Ukraine will be the second, the next. And when there was annexation of Crimea, when there was Russian invasion in Donbas, we were also saying that, look, these are the parts of the game. And the Russian game, I think the logic of the Russian game is always to create difficulties somewhere, and then to say, look, I'm the only one who can solve these difficulties. So in Syria is more or less the same logic. Russia cannot be part of the solution in the Syria conflict, but it can create even more troubles for the West. And Russia is basically saying, look, if you are not cooperating with us, we will create even more troubles for you. And look how they are doing right now in Syria. It's always quite typical with the way how they were doing in Ukraine. First, you create a huge military mess with many casualties, with airstrikes on rebels who are partners of the West, etc.
Yes, there have been many reports of how Russia has been launching airstrikes against rebel groups, which the West also backs. Do you think at some point this will backfire and Russia will feel the repercussions of fighting against forces which the West is also backing?
Yeah, of course, because I mean, imagine that these Western or rebels will have weapons who will strike against these airplanes who are bombing them, and at one place we'd have a situation when the forces backed by the West are in clash with the Russian forces, and at one point we can even have a risk of direct military conflict between even Western powers.
So there might be like a standoff where the West would be backing a rebel group, and Russia would be.
But I think that the Russians are counting on that. So they are basically selling this, very risky message that if you don't deal with us, with Russians, there will be a mess. There will be a risk of a major conflict, even between Russia and the West. So what they are now doing, there was a recent suggestion that there should be a constitutional reform in Syria, that in some 18 months there should be elections, and that Bashar al-Assad, the current president who is supported by Russians,
Peskov has recently said that Russia's basic goal is to make a safe kind of platform for Syrians to be able to vote for the government, and neither Russia or the West have any influence over who is to be the president of Syria and who is to rule Syria.
Yeah, but this is a rhetoric game, I think, again. So they created this major, much more important military risk, because now the risk is much higher, because this is a risk of direct confrontation between Western powers and Russia, between different.
Do you not think that in Ukraine, when Russia has been accused of being militarily involved in Ukraine, do you think that there is going to be no standoff between the West and Russia?
No, I don't think so, because I mean the West doesn't supply arms for Ukraine, and the West is not military present in Ukraine. So there is, I think the Syrian operation makes the stakes much higher for both the West and Russia. But again, let me repeat that in my opinion, the Russian operation in Syria is kind of repeating the same logic as it has done in Ukraine, and then as it has done in Georgia. So create a military mess, say that Russians can create big problems for the West, and then try to settle these problems through kind of a constitutional rearrangements when Russia will have a stake, and when you can put these people to the negotiations table. So the Russians' concern is now to put Bashar al-Assad and his regime to the negotiations table.
So essentially, what would be the consequences of Russia's military intervention in Syria?
For whom?
Well, it depends. If you look from a Western point of view, what would a Western viewer, depending on what's been depicted in the media, believe that what will be the repercussions that Russia will face since being involved in Syria?
Well, unfortunately, everywhere when Russia intervenes right now is a kind of again, it's not part of the solution. So it creates points points of higher instability. Unfortunately, this is the case of Ukraine. This is the case of Syria, and unfortunately, we will have a situation when everything will be so messy on Middle East. The point is that the West, I think, it doesn't have. I mean, it has to analyze Russian operations in a kind of a continuum, in a kind of because there are the same scheme, the same model, which is repeated everywhere.
Now, what about some average Russians who see this very, very strong and powerful Putin, who is launching airstrikes in Syria? How do they see Russia coming out of this? Do you think that they kind of realize that some of the consequences may be very, very grave for Russia?
I don't think so. I think that Putin is playing on the sentiments of many Russian citizens who still want a great country, and the great country means the Soviet Union for them. So when in the 90s and the years 2000, basically very important parts of Soviet Union for Russians, like Ukraine, like Baltic countries, like Central Asia, were cut off. For them, it's kind of a state which is not fully fledged, great country. Because imagine their understanding. For them, for Russians, since the epoch of Peter the Great, Russia was in Ukraine. Since the epoch of Catherine the Great, second, Russia was on the Black Sea, in Ukraine, and playing the big games.
So Putin has been trying to continue that legacy of the Great Russia.
Yes, and this is important also for this image of a great country to be present in post-Soviet states, but also to be present on the Middle East, because Russia has always been present on the Middle East. But for me, it's basically not really. So it will end up. It will end up more or less tragically, because current Russia doesn't have real resources to make it.
Right. I mean, if we take, for example, if we look at what's happening in Ukraine, basically Russia has been crippled by the economic sanctions that the West has imposed on it. But what do you think in terms of Syria? Will the West try to impose some kind of sanctions, or how will it in a way reprimand Russia for its intervention in Syria?
No, I don't think there will be any sanctions for Syria. I think the Russian logic right now is to move away from sanctions imposed because of their Ukraine operation. And this is a huge risk about that, because, as you know, the sanctions are linked to implementation of Minsk agreements. And the ultimate point of Minsk agreements is Ukraine's renewal of control of its border.
Right.
So basically, reintegration of these Donbas territories into the Ukrainian territory. I personally do not see any opportunity right now for that, for numerous reasons.
What about in the near future? What do you predict?
I don't know, because first of all, imagine there should be election on these territories according to Ukrainian legislation, with Ukrainian parties, with Ukrainian flag, who is flag everywhere with Ukrainian media. For this point, it's unbelievable to imagine the, I don't know, Ukraine Today or 1+1 or Hromadske or
basically all the Ukrainian media.
All the Ukrainian media will go there and will work freely for that, or Ukrainian parties like Poroshenko parties will participate in the election. So it's very tricky, and I think the Minsk agreement currently are impossible to implement. But the problem is that in many Western countries, where Russia's influence is important, there are talks right now that we can lift sanctions even if the Minsk agreements are not fully implemented.
Well, which countries are these?
Well, it depends on particular forces inside each country.
Right. So political parties.
Yeah,
yes.
You have these political forces in Hungary, in Czech Republic, in France, in Greece.
Yeah, Le Pen's party has been known for
Le Pen's party, then
sympathetic views towards
Putin.
Then
Les Républicains of Nicolas Sarkozy right now, they're also shifting to that. But I would like to stress that this is very dangerous. That this talk that we're going to lift sanctions only if only parts of the Minsk agreements are implemented, like ceasefire or withdrawal of heavy weapons. This is very dangerous because this is said clearly in all the EU statements, official documents, that if Minsk agreements are fully implemented, then sanctions can be reviewed. So the EU and the US should stick to this logic.
Okay. Well, very interesting chat with you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Tamara.
This has been Mr. Volodymyr Yermolenko. He's a Ukrainian political expert and one of the lecturers at Ukraine's top university. You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today.